Practical atheism. The fool who said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There's none that does good. Psalm 14, verse 1. Practical atheism is natural to man in his depraved state and very frequent in the hearts and lives of men. The fool who said in his heart, there is no God. He regards him as little as if he had no being. He said in his heart, not with his tongue, nor in his head. He never firmly thought it, nor openly asserted it. Shame put a bar to the first, and natural reason to the second. Yet perhaps he had sometimes some doubts whether there was a God or not. He wished there were not any, and sometimes hoped there was none at all. He could not raise out the notion of a deity in his mind, but he neglected the fixing the sense of God in his heart, and made it too much his business to deface and blot out those characters of God in his soul which had been left under the ruins of original nature. Men may have atheistical hearts without atheistical heads. Their reasons may defend the notion of a deity, while their hearts are empty of affection to the deity. Job's children may curse God in their hearts, though not with their lips. There is no God. Most understand it of a denial of the providence of God. As I've said in opening the former doctrine, he denies some essential attribute of God, or the exercise of that attribute in the world. He that denies any essential attribute may be said to deny the being of God. Whosoever denies angels or men to have reason and will denies the human and angelical nature, because understanding and will are essential to both those natures. There can neither be angel nor a man without them. No nature can subsist without the perfections essential to that nature, nor God be conceived of without his. The Apostle tells us in Ephesians 2 verse 12 that the Gentiles were without God in the world. So in some sense all unbelievers may be termed atheists for rejecting the mediator appointed by God. They rejected God who appointed him. But this is beyond the intended scope, natural atheism being the only subject. Yet this is deducible from it, that the title of atheist does not only belong to those who deny the existence of God, or to those who contemn all sense of a deity, and would root the conscience and reverence of God out of their souls, but belongs also to those who do not give that worship to God which is due to him, who worship many gods, or who worship one God in a false and a superstitious manner, when they have not right conceptions of God, nor intend an adoration of him according to the excellency of his nature. All those that are unconcerned for any particular religion fall under this character. Though they own a God in general, yet are willing to acknowledge any God that shall be coined by the powers under whom they live. The Gentiles were without God in the world, without the true notion of God, not without a God of their own framing. This general, or practical atheism is natural to men. Number 1, not natural by created, but by corrupted nature. It is against nature, as nature came out of the hand of God, but universally natural, as nature has been sophisticated and infected by the serpent's breath. In consideration of God, or misrepresentation of his nature, are as agreeable to corrupt nature as a disowning the being of a God is contrary to common sense. Number 2, it is universally natural. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born. Their poison is like the poison of a serpent. Psalm 53, verse 3. The wicked, and who by his birth hath a better title, they go astray from the dictates of God and the rule of their creation as soon as ever they are born. Their poison is like the poison of a serpent, which is radically the same in all of the same species. It is similarly and fundamentally in all men, though there may be a stronger restraint by a divine hand upon some men than upon others. This principle runs through the whole stream of nature. The natural bent of every man's heart is distant from God. When we attempt anything pleasing to God, it is like the climbing up of a hill against nature. When anything is displeasing to the natural man, it is like a current running down the channel in its natural course. When we attempt anything that is acknowledgement of the holiness of God, we are fain to rush with arms in our hands through a multitude of natural passions and fight the way through the oppositions of our own sensitive appetite. How softly do we naturally sink down into that which sets us at a greater distance from God. There is no active, potent, efficacious sense of a God by nature. The heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Ecclesiastes 8, verse 11. The heart, in the singular number, as if there was but one common heartbeat in all of mankind, and bent as with one pulse, with a joint consent and force to wickedness, without a sense of the authority of God in the earth, as if one heart acted every man in the world. The great apostle cites a text to verify the charge he brought against all mankind. In his interpretation, the Jews who owned one God, and were dignified with special privileges, as well as the Gentiles that maintain many gods, are within the compass of this character. The apostle leaves out the first part of the text, the fool has said in his heart, but takes in the latter part, in the verses following. The leprosy of atheism had infected the whole mass of human nature. No man among Jews or Gentiles did naturally seek God, and therefore all were void of any spark of the practical sense of the deity. The effects of this atheism are not in all externally of an equal size. Yet, in the fundamentals and radicals of it, there is not a hair's difference between the best and the worst men that ever traversed the world. The distinction is laid either in common grace, bounding and suppressing it, or in special grace, killing and crucifying it. It is in everyone either triumphant or militant, reigning or deposed. No man is any more born with sensible acknowledgments of God than he is born with a clear knowledge of the nature of all of the stars in the heavens or the planets upon the earth. None seek after God. None seek God as his role, as his end, as his happiness, which is a debt the creature naturally owes to God. He desires no communion with God. He places his happiness in anything inferior to God. He prefers everything before him, glorifies everything above him. He has no delight to know him. He regards not those paths which lead to him. He loves his own filth better than God's holiness. His actions are tinctured and dyed with self, and are void of that respect which is due from him to God. The noblest faculty of man, his understanding, wherein the remaining lineaments of the image of God are visible. The highest operation of that faculty, which is wisdom, is in the judgment of the Spirit of God devilish, whilst it is earthly and sensual, and the wisdom of the best man is no better by nature. A legion of impure spirits possess it. Devilish, as the devil, who though he believed there is a God, yet acts as if there were none, and wishes he had no superior to prescribe him a law, and inflict that punishment upon him which his crimes have merited. Hence the poison of man by nature is said to be like the poison of a serpent, alluding to that serpentine temptation which first infected mankind, and changed the nature of man into the likeness of that of the devil, so that notwithstanding the harmony of the world that presents man not only with the notice of the being of a God, but darts into their minds some remarks of his power and eternity, yet the thoughts and reasonings of man are so corrupt as may well be called diabolical, and is contrary to the perfection of God, and the original law of their nature as the actings of the devil are. For since every natural man is a child of the devil and is acted by the diabolical spirit, he must needs have that nature which his father has, and the infusion of that venom which the spirit that acts him is possessed with, though the full discovery of it may be restrained by various circumstances. Ephesians 2, verse 2. To conclude, Though man, or at least very few, arrive to a round and positive conclusion in their hearts that there is no God, yet there is no man that naturally has in his heart any reverence of God. In general, before I come to a particular proof, take some propositions. Number 1. Actions are a greater discovery of a principle than words. The testimony of works is louder and clearer than that of words. And the frame of men's hearts must be measured rather by what they do than by what they say. There may be a mighty distance between the tongue and the heart, but of course of actions is as little guilty of lying as interest is, according to our common saying. All outward impieties are the branches of an atheism at the root of our nature, as all pestilential sores are expressions of the contagion in the blood. Sin is therefore frequently called ungodliness in our English dialect. Men's practices are the best indexes of their principles. The current of a man's life is a counterpart of the frame of his heart. Who can deny an error in the spring or wheels when he perceives an error in the hand of the dial? Who can deny an atheism in the heart when so much is visible in the life? The taste of the water discovers what mineral it is strained through. A practical denial of God is worse than a verbal, because deeds have usually more of a deliberation than words. Words may be the fruit of a passion, but a set of evil actions are the fruit and evidence of a predominant evil principle in the heart. All slighting words of a prince do not argue in habitual treason, but a succession of overt treasonable attempts signify a settled treasonable disposition in the mind. Those, therefore, are more deservedly termed atheists, who acknowledge a God and walk as if there were none, than those, if there can be any such, that deny a God and walk as if there were one. A sense of God in the heart would burst out in a life. Where there is no reverence of God in the life, it is easily concluded there is less in the heart. What does not influence a man when it has the addition of the eyes and censors of outward spectators, and the care of a reputation, so much the God of the world, to strengthen it and restrain the action, must certainly have less power over the heart when it is single, without any other concurrence. The flames breaking out of a house discover the fire to be much stronger and fiercer within. The apostle judges those of the circumcision who gave heed to Jewish fables to be deniers of God, though he does not tax them with any notorious profaneness. Titus 1 verse 16. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. He gives them epithets contrary to what they arrogated to themselves. They boasted themselves to be holy. The apostle calls them abominable. They bragged that they fulfilled the law and observed the traditions of their fathers. The apostle calls them disobedient or unpersuadable. They boasted that they only had the rule of righteousness and a sound judgment concerning it. The apostle said they had a reprobate sense and unfit for any good work, and judges against all their vainglorious brags that they had not a reverence of God in their hearts. There was more of the denial of God in their works than there was acknowledgment of God in their words. Those that have neither God in their thoughts, nor in their tongues, nor in their works, cannot properly be said to acknowledge him. Where the honor of God is not practically owned in the lives of men, the being of God is not sensibly acknowledged in the hearts of men. The principle must be of the same kind with the actions. If the actions are atheistical, the principle of them can be no better. Proposition number 2. All sin is founded in a secret atheism. Atheism is the spirit of every sin. All the floods of impieties in the world break in at the gate of a secret atheism, and all several sins may disagree with one another, yet, like Herod and Pilate, against Christ, they join hand in hand against the interest of God. Though lusts and pleasures be diverse, yet they are all united in disobedience to him. All the wicked inclinations in the heart and struggling motions, secret repinings, self-applauding confidences in our own wisdom, strength, and so on, envy, ambition, revenge, are sparked from this latent fire. The language of every one of these is, I would be a lord to myself, and would not have a God superior to me. The variety of sins against the first and second table of the law, the neglects of God and violences against man are derived from this in the text. First, the fool is set in his heart, and then follows a legion of devils. As all virtuous actions spring from an acknowledgement of God, so all vicious actions rise from a lurking denial of him. All licentiousness goes glib down where there is no sense of God. Abraham judged himself not secure from murder, nor his wife from defilement in Gerar. If there were no fear of God there, he that makes no conscience of sin has no regard to the honor, and consequently none to the being of God. By the fear of God men depart from evil, Proverbs 16, verse 6. By the non-regarding of God men rush into evil. Pharaoh oppressed Israel because he knew not the Lord. If he did not deny the being of a deity, yet he had such an unworthy notion of God as was inconsistent with the nature of a deity. He, a poor creature, thought himself a mate for the Creator. In sins of omission we own not God, in neglecting to perform what he enjoins. In sins of commission we set up some lust in the place of God, and pay to that the homage which is due to our Maker. In both we disown him, in the one by not doing what he commands, and the other by doing what he forbids. We deny his sovereignty when we violate his laws. We disgrace his holiness when we cast our filth before his face. We disparage his wisdom when we set up another rule as the guide of our actions than that law he has fixed. We slight his sufficiency when we prefer a satisfaction in sin before a happiness in him alone, and his goodness when we judge it not strong enough to attract us to him. Every sin invades the rights of God and strips him of one or other of his perfections. It is such a vilifying of God as if he were not God, as if he were not the supreme creator and benefactor of the world, as if we had not our being from him, as if the air we breathed in, the food we lived by, were our own by right of supremacy, not of donation. For a subject to slight his sovereign is to slight his royalty, or a servant his master is to deny his superiority. Proposition number 3. Sin implies that God is unworthy of a being. Every sin is a kind of cursing God in the heart, an aim at the destruction of the being of God, not actually, but virtually, not in the intentions of every sinner, but in the nature of every sin. That affection which excites a man to break his law would excite him to annihilate his being, if it were in his power. A man in every sin aims to set up his own will as his rule, and his own glory as the end of his actions against the will and glory of God. And could a sinner attain his end, God would be destroyed. God cannot outlive his will and his glory. God cannot have another rule but his own will, nor another end but his own honor. Sin is calling a turning the back upon God, a kicking against him as if he were a slighter person than the meanest beggar. What greater contempt can be shown to the meanest, vilest person than to turn the back, lift up the heel, and thrust away with indignation? All which actions, so they signify that such a one has a being, yet they testify also that he is unworthy of a being, that he is an unusual being in the world, and that it were well the world were rid of him. All sin against knowledge is called a reproach of God. Reproach is a vilifying a man as unworthy to be admitted into your company. We naturally judge God unfit to be conversed with. God is a term turned from by a sinner. Sin is a term turned to, which implies a greater excellency in the nature of sin than in the nature of God. And as we naturally judge it more worthy to have a being in our affections, so consequently more worthy to have a being in the world than that infinite nature from whom we derive our beings and our all, and upon whom with a kind of disdain we turn our backs. Whosoever thinks the notion of a deity unfit to be cherished in his mind by warm meditation implies that he does not care whether he has a being in the world or not. Now, though the light of a deity shines so clearly in man, and the stings of his conscience are so smart that he cannot absolutely deny the being of a god, yet most men endeavor to smother this knowledge and make the notion of a god a sapless and useless thing. Romans 1 verse 28. They like not to retain God in their knowledge. It is said Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, Genesis 4 verse 16. That is, from the worship of God. Our refusing or abhorring the presence of a man implies a carelessness whether he continues in the world or not. It is a using him, as if he had no being, or as if he were not concerned in it. Hence all men in Adam, under the emblem of the prodigal, are said to go into a far country, not in respect of place, because of God's omnipresence, but in respect of acknowledgement and affection. They mind and love anything but God. And the descriptions of the nations of the world, lying in the ruins of Adam's fall and the dregs of that revolt, is that they know not God. They forget God, as if there were no such being above him. And indeed he that does the works of the devil owns the devil to be more worthy of observance, and consequently of a being than God, whose nature he forgets and whose presence he abhors. Proposition number 4. Every sin in its own nature would render God a foolish and impure being. Many transgressors esteem their acts which are contrary to the law of God both wise and good. If so, the law against which they are committed must be both foolish and impure. What a reflection is there, then, upon the lawgiver! The moral law is not properly a mere act of God's will considered in itself, or a tyrannical edict, like those of whom it may well be said, stat pro raton voluntas, but it commands those things which are good in their own nature, and prohibits those things which are in their own nature evil, and therefore is an act of his wisdom and righteousness, the result of his wise counsel, and an extract of his pure nature. As all the laws of just lawgivers are not only the acts of their will, but of a will governed by reason and justice, and for the good of the public whereof they are conservators. If the moral commands of God were only acts of the will, and had not an intrinsic necessity, reason, and goodness, God might have commanded the quite contrary, and made a contrary law, whereby that which we now call vice might have been canonized for virtue. He might then have forbid any worship of him, love to him, fear of his name. He might then have commanded murder, thefts, adulteries. In the first he would have untied the link of duty from the creature, and dissolved the obligations of creatures to him, which is impossible to be conceived. For from the relation of a creature to God, obligations to God and duties upon those obligations do necessarily result. It had been against the rule of goodness and justice to have commanded the creature not to love him, and fear and obey him. This had been a command against righteousness, goodness, and intrinsic obligations to gratitude. And should murder, adulteries, rapines have been commanded instead of the contrary, God would have destroyed his own creation. He would have acted against the rule of goodness and order. He had been an unjust, tyrannical governor of the world. Public society would have been cracked in pieces, and the world become a shambles, a brothel house, a place below the common sentiments of a mere man. All sin, therefore, being against the law of God, the wisdom and holy rectitude of God's nature is denied in every act of disobedience. And what is the consequence of this, but that God is both foolish and unrighteous in commanding that, which was neither an act of wisdom, as a governor, nor an act of goodness, as a benefactor to his creature. As was said before, presumptuous sins are called reproaches of God, Numbers 15, verse 30. The soul that doth aught presumptuously reproaches the Lord. Reproaches of men are either for natural, moral, or intellectual defects. All reproaches of God must imply a charge either of unrighteousness or ignorance. If unrighteousness, it is the denial of his holiness. If of ignorance, it is a blemishing his wisdom. If God's laws were not wise and holy, God would not enjoin them. And if they are so, we deny infinite wisdom and holiness in God by not complying with them. As when a man believes not God when he promises, he makes him a liar, 1 John 5, verse 10. So he that does not obey a wise and holy God commanding, makes him guilty either of folly or of unrighteousness. Now suppose you knew an absolute atheist, who denied the being of a God, yet had a life free from any notorious spot or defilement. Would you in reason count him so bad as the other that owns a God in being, yet sets aside, by his course of action, such a black imputation of folly and impurity upon the God he professes to own? An imputation which renders any man a most despicable creature. Proposition number 5. Sin, in its own nature, endeavors to render God a most miserable being. It is nothing but an opposition to the will of God. The will of no creature is so much contradicted as the will of God is by devils and men. And there is nothing under the heavens that the affections of human nature stand more point-blank against than against God. There is a slight of him in all the faculties of man. Our souls are as unwilling to know him as our wills are averse to follow him. Romans 8, verse 7. The carnal mind is enmity against God. It is not subject to the law of God, nor can be subject. It is true, God's will cannot be hindered of its effect, for then God would not be supremely blessed, but unhappy and miserable. All misery arises from a lack of that which a nature would have, and ought to have. Besides, if anything could frustrate God's will, it would be superior to him. God would not be omnipotent, and so would lose the perfection of the deity, and consequently the deity itself. For that which did wholly defeat God's will would be more powerful than God. But sin is a contradiction to the will of God's revelation, to the will of his precept, and therein does naturally tend to a superiority over God, and would usurp his omnipotence and deprive him of his blessedness. For if God had not an infinite power to turn the designs of it to his own glory, but the will of sin could prevail, God would be totally deprived of his blessedness. Does not sin endeavor to subject God to the extravagant and contrary wills of men, and make him more of a slave than any creature can be? For the will of no creature, not the meanest and most despicable creature, is so much crossed as the will of God is by sin. Isaiah 42, verse 24, Thou hast made me to serve with thy sins. Thou hast endeavored to make a mere slave of me by sin. Sin endeavors to subject the blessed God to the humor and lust of every person in the world. Proposition number 6. Men sometimes in some circumstances wish the not being of a God. This some think to be the meaning of the text. The fool has said in his heart, There is no God. That is, he wishes there were no God. Many tamper with their own hearts to bring them to a persuasion that there is no God, and when they cannot do that, they conjure up wishes that there were none. Men naturally have some conscience of sin and some notices of justice, Romans 1, verse 32. They know the judgment of God, and they know the demerit of sin. They know the judgment of God, and that they which do such things are worthy of death. What is the consequence of this but fear of punishment? And what is the issue of that fear but a wishing the judge either unwilling or unable to vindicate the honor of his violated law? When God is the object of such a wish, it is a virtual undeifying of him. Not to be able to punish is to be impotent. Not to be willing to punish is to be unjust. Imperfections inconsistent with the deity. God cannot be supposed without an infinite power to act, and an infinite righteousness as the rule of acting. Fear of God is natural to all men, not a fear of offending him, but a fear of being punished by him. The wishing the extinction of God has its degree in men according to the degree of their fears of his just vengeance. And though such a wish be not in its meridian, but in the damned in hell, yet it has its starts and motions in affrighted and awakened consciences on the earth, under this rank of wishers, that there was no God, or that God were destroyed. All these fall. Terrified consciences that are Magor, Mishabib, see nothing but matter of fear round about. As they have lived without the bounds of the law, they are afraid to fall under the stroke of his justice. Fear wishes the destruction of that which it apprehends hurtful. It considers him as a God whom vengeance belongs, as the judge of all the earth. The less hope such an one has of his pardon, the more joy he would have to hear that his judge should be stripped of his life. He would entertain with delight any reasons that might support him in the conceit that there were no God. In his present state, such a doctrine would be a sincerity from an account. He would as much rejoice if there were no God to inflame in hell for him, as any guilty malefactor would be, if there were no judge to order a gibbet for him. Shame may bridle men's words, but the heart will be casting about for some arguments this way to secure itself, such as are at any time in Francis Spira's case, would be willing to cease to be creatures, that God might cease to be judge. The fool has said in his heart, there is no Elohim, no judge, fancying God without any exercise of his judicial authority. And there is not any wicked man under anguish of spirit, but were it within the reach of his power, would take away the life of God, and rid himself of his fears by destroying his avenger. Number 2. Debauched persons are not without such wishes sometimes. An obstinate servant wishes his master's death, for whom he expects correction for his debaucheries. As man stands in his corrupt nature, it is impossible but one time or other most debauched persons at least have some kind of velities or imperfect wishes. It is as natural to men to abhor those things which are unsuitable and troublesome, as it is to please themselves in things agreeable to their minds and humors. And since man is so deeply in love with sin, as to count it the most estimable good, he cannot but wish the abolition of that law which checks it, and consequently the change of the lawgiver which enacted it. And in wishing a change in the holy nature of God, he wishes the destruction of God, who cannot be God if he cease to be immutably holy. They do certainly wish that God had not a holy will to command them, as despairing souls wish that God had not a righteous will to punish them, and to wish conscience extinct, for the molestations they receive from it, is to wish the power conscience represents out of the world also. Since the state of sinners is a state of distance from God, and the language of sinners to God is depart from us, they desire as little the continuance of his being as they desire the knowledge of his ways. The same reason which moves them to desire God's distance from them would move them to desire God's not being, since the greatest distance would be most agreeable to them. The destruction of God must be so too, because there is no greater distance from us than in not being. Men would rather have God not to be than themselves under control, that sensuality might range at pleasure. He is like a heifer sliding from the yoke, Hosea 4:16. The cursing of God in the heart, feared by Job of his children, intimates of wishing God despoiled of his authority, that their pleasure might not be damped by his law. Besides, is there any natural man that sins against actuated knowledge, but either thinks or wishes that God might not see him, that God might not know his actions? And is not this to wish the destruction of God, who cannot be God unless he were immense and omniscient? Number 3, under this rank fall those who perform external duties only out of a principle of slavish fear. Many men perform those duties that the law enjoins with the same sentiments that slaves perform their drudgery, and are constrained in their duties by no other consideration but those of the whip and the cudgel. Since therefore they do it with reluctancy and secretly murmur while they seem to obey, they would be willing that both the command were recalled and the master that commands them were in another world from them. The spirit of adoption makes men act towards God as a father. A spirit of bondage only eyes him as a judge. Those that look upon their superiors as tyrannical will not be much concerned in their welfare, and would be more glad to have their nails pared than be under perpetual fear of them. Many men regard not the infinite goodness and the service of him, but consider him as cruel, tyrannical, injurious to their liberty. Adam's posterity are not free from the sentiments of their common father till they are regenerate. You know what conceit was the hammer whereby the hellish Jael struck the nail into our first parents, which conveyed death, together with the same imagination to all of their posterity. Genesis 3 verse 5. God knows that in the day you eat thereof your eyes shall be open, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Alas, poor souls! God knew what he did when he forbade you that fruit. He was jealous you should be too happy. It was cruelty in him to deprive you of a food so pleasant and delicious. The apprehension of the severity of God's command rises up no less in desires that there were no God over us than Adam's apprehension of envying God for the restraint of one tree moved him to attempt to be equal with God. Fear is as powerful to produce the one in his posterity as pride was to produce the other in a common root. When we apprehend a thing hurtful to us, we desire so much evil to it as may render it incapable of doing us the hurt we fear. As we wish the preservation of what we love or hope for, so we are naturally apt to wish the not being of that whence we fear some hurt or trouble. We must not understand this as if any man did formerly wish the destruction of God as God. God in himself is an infinite mirror of his goodness and ravishing loveliness. He is infinitely good, and so universally good, and nothing but good, and is therefore so agreeable to a creature, as a creature, that it is impossible that the creature, while it bears itself to God as a creature, should be guilty of this, but thirst after him and cherish every motion to him, as no man wishes the destruction of any creature as a creature, but as it may conduce to something which he counts may be beneficial to himself. So no man does, nor perhaps can wish the cessation of the being of God, as God, for then he must wish his own being to cease also. But as he considers him clothed with some perfections which he apprehends as injurious to him, as his holiness in forbidding sin, his justice in punishing sin, and God being judged in those perfections contrary to what the revolted creature thinks convenient and good for himself, he may wish God stripped of those perfections, that thereby he may be free from all fear of trouble and grief from him in his fallen state. In wishing God deprived of those, he wishes God deprived of his being, because God cannot retain his deity without a love of righteousness and a hatred of iniquity, and he could not testify his love to the one, or his loathing of the other, without encouraging goodness and witnessing his anger against iniquity. Let us now appeal to ourselves and examine our own consciences. Did we never please ourselves sometimes in the thoughts how happy we should be, how free in our vain pleasures if there were no God? Have we not desired to be our own lords, without control, subject to no law but our own, and be guided by no will but that of the flesh? Did we never rage against God under his afflicting hand? Did we never wish God stripped of his holy will to command and his righteous will to punish? Thus much for the general. In conclusion, man would set up himself first as his own rule, secondly, as his own end and happiness,